Jerusalem, the Contested City. Lecture 8. The Distant Shrine. The Muslims Come to Jerusalem. 638 through 750 of the Common Era.
We have now reached a crucial turning in the history of Jerusalem. In the year 635 or 638, a Muslim army stood before the city, and eventually they will take it, and it marks a change in the fortunes of the city which lasts to the present day. From this time onward, there are now in play in the city all three monotheistic groups, Jews, Christians, and now finally Muslims. And the three of them, from that day to this, are trying to work out their destiny, and the destiny of the city among themselves. First, we must step back a little bit and try to understand something about Islam and the Quran. Because the Muslims who arrived there in those years did not come as strangers, either as strangers to the city or as strangers to what went on inside it. They knew something about Jerusalem, and in fact they were very oriented toward the city. Indeed, some people have even suggested that the whole initial impetus, the drive of the Muslims up into Palestine and Syria, may have been a form of unfulfilled Zionism, that they were heading for Jerusalem. This is pure surmise, of course, but the fact remains that the chief book of the Muslims, the things that make them scripturaries, the thing that makes them monotheists, the Quran, these revelations that were given to Muhammad over the course of 22 years of his life, is really a very biblical kind of text. Biblical not in the sense that the material came from the Bible, as Muslims would deny, but that the material in it is similar, and in some cases identical, to material that's in the Bible. So that the Quran, if one opens it even at random, one finds immediately stories of Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Ishmael, David, Solomon, Jesus, and his mother Mary. So we're talking about the Quran as really as a biblical book. Jerusalem is not mentioned by name in the Quran, but it seems to be in there by a kind of indirection. That is to say, there may be allusions to it. The Quran, generally speaking, is a book filled with allusion. It refers to things in a kind of oblique fashion, and there may be a reference to the destruction or the two destructions of Jerusalem that are in the Quran. Although, as I say, it is not mentioned by name, the city. But there is a more potent connection between Islam and Jerusalem. The man through whom the Quran was revealed. This is God's word on one end and an audience of humankind on the other. But the medium for this message, the person who pronounced the words of the Quran, which are really God's words, is Muhammad. And Muhammad's life unfolded far away from Jerusalem. Mecca is halfway down the Arabian Peninsula, perhaps a 30-day caravan journey just from the frontier of Jordan to Mecca, and perhaps another five or 6 days to Jerusalem itself. So it's at quite a distance. And yet Muhammad has some sort of connection with Jerusalem, perhaps two connections with Jerusalem. The first is a somewhat oblique, though an interesting one. In the Quran, Muhammad is portrayed as being asked why he has changed his direction of prayer. And he explains why he has. His new direction of prayer is facing toward Mecca, his native city and the site of the house of God, the house of Allah, in the midst of Mecca. And this change that takes place, which is the direction of prayer for Muslims today. Muslims all pray facing toward Mecca. But it seems that before this point, this is what the Muslim tradition tells us at any rate, that Muhammad used to pray facing toward Jerusalem. Now, the people who prayed facing Jerusalem were the Jews. Christians prayed facing the east, Jews prayed facing Jerusalem. And Muhammad apparently had that custom before the year 622 or 3 when he changed his prayer direction. The last connection of Muhammad to Jerusalem is much more direct and much more graphic. The Quran mentions, just in the first verse of the 17th surah or chapter of the Quran, that God took his servant, presumably Muhammad, by night from the sacred shrine, which is probably Mecca, to what is called in the Quran the distant shrine, al-Masjid al-Aqsa. And after some initial hesitation about this, Muslim tradition has zeroed in on the interpretation that this distant shrine to which Muhammad was taken by night was Jerusalem. And so they began to grow up in Islamic circles the whole story of this famous night journey, which had Muhammad mounted on a mythical steed and carried by night, as the Quran says, to the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where he is set down inside those precincts, and then carried from there up into the highest heaven, the seventh, beyond the seventh heaven, and then finally back to Mecca, all in the same evening. So that this is identified, this miraculous journey is identified with, the goal of it at any rate, is identified with Jerusalem. So there's another connection, so that the Muslims had in their minds by the time they reached the gates of Jerusalem, which happened, as I say, in the year either 635 or 638. And the city, as happened very often in these early days, the city capitulated without a struggle, capitulated on terms, we might say. And according to the Muslim story, which may be more legendary than fact, the surrender of the city, which was negotiated on the Christian side by the bishop of the city, there was no Roman authority present there, so it was the bishop who negotiated. But on the Muslim side, the surrender was accepted by no less than the second caliph of Islam, the famous Umar. And the caliph, by the way, is the head of the entire Muslim community, the world Muslim community, and that Omar is the second of these caliphs. And so he accepted the surrender of the city, and the Muslims now occupied. How many of them is hard to say. Perhaps there was a garrison of maybe, 1,500, 2,000, maybe as many as 3,000, which I will explain shortly. According to this story, Umar asked the bishop to be taken to the holy place of Jerusalem, and he was taken in the first instance to the Holy Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And he said, no, this is not what he had in mind, and of course we know why. According to the Quran, Jesus had not been crucified at all. Jesus was taken up, some effigy of Jesus had been crucified, and Jesus, the man Jesus, the prophet Jesus, as the Muslims regard him, was taken alive into heaven. And so there was no crucifixion of Jesus, there was no burial of Jesus, and there was no resurrection of Jesus in the Muslim eyes. Jesus is in heaven now, and he will return eventually to suffer human death on earth at the last days. It's part of the final scene, the end of days in the Muslim scenario. At any rate, it was not the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So he went instead, perhaps at the advice of some Jews, he went instead up to the Temple Mount. The temple atop the mount had been destroyed, as we've seen, in the year 70. And from the year 70 down to the present being 635, nothing had been built up there. It was a field of ruins. And in fact, according to one story, it was worse than a field of ruins. It was a field of garbage, that the Christians of Jerusalem had made the Temple Mount a kind of garbage dump themselves. And it makes a certain amount of sense because the Christians have a kind of theological attitude toward the place. The destruction of the temple, which Jesus had predicted, came about, and it was part of God's punishment of the Jews for their rejection of Jesus. This is the Christian theological take on that destruction of the temple. And the Christians never intended to rebuild it again. That was the last thing from their mind, and they certainly were not about to permit the Jews to rebuild it. As a matter of fact, there were no Jews in Jerusalem since the year 135, when the Romans banned them because of an insurrection. So Omar orders the Temple Mount, which subsequently is known to the Muslims as Al-Haram al-Sharif, or the Noble Sanctuary, Haram being an area, a taboo or a sacred area, Sharif meaning something which is noble, so the Noble Sanctuary. And he has constructed up on the Temple Mount, the southern end of the Temple Mount, a mosque, which is called, because of the connection with the Muhammad's night journey. The phrase is used from the Quranic phrase is used to describe this mosque. The mosque is called Al-Aqsa Mosque, because that place in the Quran said Muhammad was carried by night to Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, the distant shrine. So this is the distant shrine, this mosque that commemorates this. And it is it sits there today at the southern end of the platform, although the present-day version has been much rebuilt and much enlarged from Omar's building, which was described as housing perhaps 3,000 people, which makes us think that that may have been the male population, Muslim population of Jerusalem at the time. And therefore, we have some idea of the garrison that was left behind to guard this place. As the Muslim armies passed through, they didn't pause. They just left behind some kind of garrison in each city and then picked up new recruits along the way to replenish their armies, so that by the time they reached Spain, for example, the armies must have been made up of very few of the original people and was mostly composed probably of Berbers at that stage. But at any rate, there was a garrison left behind at Jerusalem, and as we guessed that there was perhaps 3,000 people. Out of a total population we can't even estimate. Since we can't estimate it, let me just simply guess it as something perhaps like 10,000, 15,000. We've got to remember that Jerusalem had just gone through a kind of bloodbath a few years before this, during the wars with Persia, when the city had been occupied and there was a considerable slaughter there. So the city was still recovering. At any rate, Omar did a number of things in Jerusalem to mark the Muslim takeover. The first was he permitted the Jews who wished to return to Judea, and more specifically to Jerusalem. And as I just mentioned, the Jews had been banned from the city and the territory around it since the year 135. It wasn't the Christians who had banned them from the place, it was the Romans, because as a result of an insurrection that had taken place in that year. And so there were no Jews living there up to this point. And the Muslims, who had no particular animus against the Jews and didn't inherit the Roman feeling about them as insurrectionist parties, permitted them to return to Jerusalem. So for the first time in a very long time, there were Jews living in Jerusalem. Many of them had come from Galilee, which had turned into the center of Jewish life in the area. But as time passed, Jews came from other places to settle into the city. They were never a very large part of the population, and they were never a particularly prosperous part of the population, as we shall see subsequently. Another thing that Omar did is to extend to the people of Jerusalem, in the first instance the Christians, because the population was whatever number of Jews had come in on this occasion. The main part of the population of Jerusalem was certainly Christian. He extended to these people what is called the Dhimma. The Dhimma is a concordat instituted by Muhammad in the first instance to deal with Jews and Christians, people of the book, people who had the scripture, who lived under Muslim sovereignty. That once they had accepted Muslim sovereignty, they were governed by the regulations of this Dhimma, which was an agreement, a contract, in which the Muslim community pledged to allow them the freedom to practice their monotheistic religion, whether it's Judaism or Christianity. It wasn't, in return, the Jews and the Christians had to pay tribute to their sovereigns, something which they had always done to earlier sovereigns. This was not something new, the paying of this tax or tribute. And in addition to that, there were certain stipulations about their practice of the religion, at least in the public regard, that they were not permitted to proselytize, obviously, among the Muslims, and they were not permitted to make public display of their religion or to build new facilities. Now, these two parts of the contract, the public display and the new facilities, will eventually, in the course of time, create a serious set of problems in Jerusalem, in Muslim Jerusalem. The Muslims are here to stay. I mean, the Muslims take over in 635, and the Muslim sovereignty over the city doesn't really end until 1967. So we're talking about a very long time. And this the public display of religion, which is part of Islamic religious law. It's not statute law. It can't be changed. Is still in place wherever the Sharia, or the Islamic law, is the law of the land. And that what Omar is doing here in 635 is simply extending it to the citizens of Jerusalem. Now, the document, which is called the Pact or the Covenant of Omar, as it exists today, as it is set down, is probably a forgery. The stipulations of it, as it's laid out, and it's frequently waived over the course of the centuries, waived by Christians in the faces of Muslims as a kind of guarantee of their rights. But there's been a lot of haggling over the issues of this dhimma, particularly in the construction of new churches or new synagogues, as we shall see. The Muslim armies pass, and life goes on. Life goes in another direction. The armies go in another direction, and the conquest, the expansion of Islam goes on, and Jerusalem goes back to kind of a quiet position. We don't know a lot about it in the next couple of years. Where we begin to get some sort of sense of the city is in the year 661. So about 30 years later, there is a change of dynasty in Islam. The caliphs, the rulers of the Islamic community, who had been resident up to this point in the city of Medina, the place where Muhammad had died, they were replaced by a new dynasty called the Umayyads, a new family, which ruled continuously as a family, as a dynasty, between the year 661, when they begin, until the year 750. And their capital is not remote Medina, down in the Arabian Peninsula, but up right in the middle of the Fertile Crescent, in the city of Damascus. Now, Damascus is their capital. But what concerns us here is the possibility that early on, very early on in their careers, the Umayyads may have entertained the notion that Jerusalem should be made the capital of the abode of Islam. Jerusalem had the attraction of being a sacred city already to Muslims, from its biblical associations, connection with Abraham, connection with Muhammad's own life, that famous night journey that I mentioned. And so it makes some sort of sense. The reason we think this is there are two pieces of evidence that point to this. One is the uncovering beginning in 1967, 1968, ironically by Israeli archaeologists, of extensive Umayyad buildings around the southern end of the Temple Mount and around the western side. So there was considerable building activity, and these are not just residences. There were some residences built, but these buildings are rather large, and they seem to be official. They seem to be bureaucratic. They seem to be what we would call office buildings or palaces, rather than simply residences or homes. And the suspicion is that this may have been part of an administrative complex that was being planned for Jerusalem. The building just to the south of the Temple Mount, apparently, we don't have the upper stories, we just have the foundations, obviously, but the upper stories seem to have joined to the Aqsa Mosque with some sort of little ramp that crossed the street that ran along the wall of the Temple Mount. So that's part one of the evidence. Part two is one of the most spectacular buildings in the city of Jerusalem, which is still standing there today, and it's called the Dome of the Rock. It is accurately named. It is sometimes, by the way, called the Mosque of Omar. This is a term that has been applied to this building, which is totally wrong. First of all, it is not a mosque. It is a shrine, and it was not built by Omar by any stretch of the imagination. And so it's the Dome of the Rock, and I will refer to it that way. And the name, as I say, is accurate because it is a shrine, a domed shrine, set on an octagonal base over the jutting bedrock on the Temple Mount. Right? The bedrock is exposed, and it is under this dome, so it has been enshrined. And we're not quite sure what this is about. I mean, the enshrinement of a stone is not exactly typical of Islam. Islam is a very sort of pure form of monotheism. It's like Judaism in this regard, in that it has a very short toleration of images or effigies or any such thing. And so the veneration of a stone seems rather alien. However, there is embedded in one corner of the Kaaba, that house of God in the middle of Mecca, a black stone. Now, it was there before Islam began in Muhammad's lifetime, but it certainly was incorporated into Islam and is regarded as a sort of sacred object. Well, this rock under the dome, and I emphasize again, it is bedrock, it is not a stone sitting there, is of some interest and of some importance, clearly, to those early Muslims. We know when the building was built. It was built by the Umayyads, and it was built more precisely by the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik in the year 692. We can be sure of this, as we can be sure of very few other things, by the fact that there's an inscription that runs around the inside of the dome, and it gives the date of the construction. So we know by whom and when it was built. But why was it built? What was the point of this Umayyad Dome of the Rock, which tradition tells us, and which our eyes tell us as well, was very likely built by Byzantine craftsmen. The work on it, the mosaic work, the inscriptions, although they are in Arabic, the decor of the interior is very much in the Byzantine style. If we didn't have those Arabic inscriptions inside, it could very well look like a Byzantine building. So why was this thing built? Well, one story that was circulating in Muslim circles at one point was that Abdul Malik, this caliph, intended to divert the pilgrimage from Mecca to Jerusalem. By pilgrimage, I'm referring, of course, to the Hajj, the pilgrimage that goes on annually at a certain point in the year, to which all Muslims must make this Hajj, this ritual pilgrimage, at least once in their lifetime. So it is the single most important liturgical event in the life of Muslims, and certainly in the Muslim year. And it is a fairly complex ritual that unfolds in the city of Mecca and its environs. Now, at the time of Abdul Malik, the city of Mecca, the town of Mecca at this stage, was in the hands of a rebel. There was an insurrection, and one of his rivals for the caliphate had seized hold of Mecca and was holding out there. And so the story was in circulation that what Abdul Malik intended was, as I say, to divert the pilgrimage, the central Islamic ritual, away from Mecca to Jerusalem. There are problems with the story. It's mentioned by just a couple of people, not by everybody, first of all. Secondly, it is such an enormous act. It would be such an enormous act. You think it would be probably have attracted more attention if that was indeed the case. But at least it has the benefit of explaining what this building was about, that Muslims, during the course of the Hajj, have to circumambulate the Kaaba, have to walk around it 7 times, that this was built as the shrine around which Muslims would circumambulate here atop what is clearly one of the holy places of Islam, the Temple Mount, or the Haram al-Sharif, as they called it. So it is possible, right, that this is what the Umayyads had in mind, and it fits in with this other business about their thoughts that maybe this should be their capital. Well, it never got to be their capital, right? They ruled from Damascus, as I said, and not from Jerusalem. But they certainly enhanced Jerusalem. They rebuilt and enlarged for the first time the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and they built this Dome of the Rock, in addition to these other buildings that I mentioned at the south side of the Haram. We know a little bit about the city at this stage because we have the account of Christian pilgrims who are passing through the city. Christian pilgrimage, as we saw earlier, began probably in the age of Constantine in the 4th century, after he had begun to enshrine the holy places of Jerusalem. And that one of the notable things about this pilgrimage is that it wasn't interrupted by the fact that Jerusalem changed hands in the 630s, that it passed from Christian sovereignty to Muslim sovereignty. Now the pilgrims who came after 635, and they came shortly after the Muslim takeover, described the city as interesting and the Muslims as curiously interesting people. They thought that they ran a good city, that they maintained order. They had no problems. There were occasional complaints that They were stopped on the road and asked if they had paid their tribute. Since they were Christians, they were subject to tribute, and the sovereign powers are always trying to collect tribute. And so there was that thing about the stipulation of tribute. But by and large, they were not impeded by the Muslims. They were not affected by them. And they found the whole experience rather curious and interesting rather than threatening. Now, eventually, it will become threatening as well, because there will be a lot of things, a lot of issues will arise between Muslims and Christians over the course of the centuries, and the relationship will become tortured in many cases. To cite only one thing that happens between them is the business of the Crusades. But all of that is still in the future, in the 7th and 8th century, when these pilgrims arrive in the city of Jerusalem. We also have information about the Jewish community in Jerusalem. The Jews, almost from the beginning, the Jews living in Jerusalem almost from the beginning, were, as I mentioned, a rather impoverished and rather small community. And from the beginning down to well into modern times, well into the 19th century, the Jews of Jerusalem who resided there did not have any sort of source of income of their own. They were, as I say, a small community, and they were not particularly well educated at this point, and so they say they had their own income was small and uncertain, and that we know, as a matter of fact, that the Jewish community there was supported almost entirely by generous endowments and money and funds sent to them from abroad. As I say, they happened well into the 19th century. In the case of these early years, the chief source of the funding was from a Jewish community that was prosperous in the Muslim city of Fustat, which is called Old Cairo and is right next to where the modern city of Cairo. That there was a Jewish colony there that was doing fairly well, and they sent money to their co-religionists in Jerusalem for their support. We have documentation on this from the records of that Jewish community in Egypt, this so-called Cairo Geniza, which is an archive that was discovered and was in the storehouse of the Cairo synagogue, was the collected junk mail and junk and old documents, just things that were never thrown out, one of those closets that was never cleaned, and it had all of this extraordinary information, detailed information. And from that, we learn, from this Geniza, as it was called, the storehouse of the synagogue, we discover about the relations between the Fustat Jews and their poor co-religionists in Jerusalem. The Jews in Jerusalem had another problem besides poverty. Among the Jews who arrived there were Jews from Iraq, and they brought with them a problem they were having at home, and they imported it into the city of Jerusalem. This problem was a rather profound dispute going on among the Jews between one group called the Karaites and another group called the Rabbinites. The Karaites were like the ancient Sadducees among the Jews, and perhaps somewhat like modern Reform Jews, in that the Karaites did not accept the authority, or the binding authority, I should say, of these chief rabbinic documents, namely the Mishnah and the Talmud. Mishnah and the Talmud were reputedly part of the oral Torah that had been given to Moses on Sinai, that he had been given two Torahs, one written down, our Bible, and the other called the oral Torah, in which there were additional laws and enactments, etc. The Karaites just did not accept this premise. They denied that there was an oral Torah. They denied that the Mishnah and the Talmud had any sort of binding authority on the practice or the behavior of Jews, that it might be advice or counsel or sometimes maybe even a good idea, but certainly not a binding part of Jewish law. The Karaites tried to live on, like the later Protestants and later Reformed Jews, on Scripture alone. Just what the Bible said, that's what you should do. Otherwise, you are free to act as you wish. They were opposed by the more traditional Jews, the Rabbinites, the people who accepted rabbinic authority, accepted the authority of the Mishnah and the Talmud. And so, in effect, what developed was a kind of schism about authority, did the rabbis have authority over the Jewish community? And the Karaite answer was no, and the Rabbinite answer was yes. And so there were two communities in Iraq, and there were two communities in the end in Jerusalem and in many other places, because this schism, this split in the community, spread throughout the Jewish diaspora. But in Egypt, in Jerusalem, it was particularly powerful and notable because the community was so small and the quarters were so small, and they were competing over a very tiny share of the pie. The Muslims, for their part, generally tried to encourage minority groups among their subjects. It was always to their benefit to keep a disequilibrium among the subject peoples, and so they normally favored the Karaites as the minority group among the Jews. And so the Karaites managed to stay in existence and continued for a very long time. And this schism, as I say, also continued for a very long time. And so now we have in place in Jerusalem, we have all the players are now sort of there. Right? We have the Muslims who are in charge. There's a Muslim governor of Jerusalem, and there is a Muslim minority of people, but they are the rulers, minority in numbers. The majority of the population in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, probably still, are Christians who are scattered throughout the city with their holy places which, as for the time being at least, were not much interfered with, that the Christians came and went on pilgrimage and on visitation to these places in ways that they were not particularly interfered with. And then finally there were the Jews, the smallest group of the three, living in a kind of tiny wedge between the Christians on their west and the Muslims on their east in the southern half of the city. And their life was as I say, rather restricted by simply by their own penury. They were free to come and go as they wished, and indeed, one of the interesting things about this early stage in the Jewish presence in Jerusalem, some Jews may actually have gone up and prayed on the Temple Mount. That there was no prohibition. There seems to have been no prohibition either from the Muslims or, indeed, from the Jews' own authorities. Later on, there will be no Jews up on the Temple Mount by reason of prohibitions from both sides, that the Muslims didn't want them up there, and nor did they want Christians up there. And the Jews, for their part, began to develop a kind of a sense of the sacredness of the place, and began to move a little bit back from the Temple Mount itself. That at any rate, in later times, we don't get any stories whatsoever of Jews going up on the Temple Mount, except occasionally, as Christians did occasionally, by a kind of stealth, just out of kind of curiosity. So that Jews began to worship, we imagine, around the Temple Mount. Right? The Temple Mount, we must remember, is not a mount at all. It's a Herodian platform. It's a large, heavily blocked platform which sits there on the eastern hill of Jerusalem, and sits there to this day.
After listening to Lecture 8, a student posed this question to Professor Peters. Where did the rock in the Dome of the Rock come from? Now let's listen to Professor Peters' response.
No, the interesting thing is that there is very little indication about where that rock was or what it signified or where it came from. There's no mention of it, for example, in any of the earlier descriptions of the Jewish temple. Josephus, who described Herod's temple in considerable detail, doesn't say anything about such a rock. And even during the period after the destruction of the temple, there's hardly any indication of what was up there, and certainly not a rock of an exposed part of the bedrock of that size. The rock itself is not flat. It juts up from the earth, and it is exposed, as I say, inside the Dome of the Rock, and it shows no signs whatsoever of having been planed down or used for architectural purposes whatsoever. It is just the native rock. The only marks on it, there are two things about it. First of all, there are some cuttings off the top of it, and we know where they came from. When the Christians took over during the Middle Ages, during the Crusades, for that 100-odd years when they controlled Jerusalem, and they made the Dome of the Rock into a church, they used to sell parts of the rock, slabs, slivers off the rock, which they had cut to visiting pilgrims. So we know where those things came from. The other curious thing about this rock is that there is a grotto underneath it, a considerable grotto, which is accessible by stairs that goes down. And there is a hole in the surface of the rock that lets light and air into this grotto. Nobody knows when that was put there or what its function was. It seems to have been there fairly early. There's a Muslim legend that when Muhammad approached in his night journey, the rock attempted to rise from above the ground, and that's why there is that space underneath. And Muhammad said, stay where you are or whatever, but that's no explanation as far as we're concerned. So this rock is quite mysterious, and as is the building that surrounds it.
This ends Lecture 8. This ends Lecture 8. This ends Lecture 8. This ends Lecture 8.